Hello and welcome to this Lit in Colour Pioneers event. My name's Jane Garnett and I'm in conversation this afternoon with Tanika Gupta, the award-winning playwright. I'm a historian teaching and researching in Oxford University at Wadham College. And a few years ago I was part of a major project studying the impact of diaspora in different cultures across the world. My focus was on East London from the late 19th century to the present, with a particular interest in the intersections between diverse religious cultures over the last 150 years. And partly because of this work, and partly because once upon a time I was Tanika's tutor in Oxford, I was privileged to be invited to edit and write the introduction to the student edition of her play, The Empress. Lit in Colour is a campaign run by Penguin Books in partnership with the race equality think tank, the Runnymede Trust. Bloomsbury, the publisher of The Empress, are pioneers of the Lit in Colour, partners of the Lit in Culture campaign, basically focusing the spotlight on plays and drama. Lit in Colour is all about supporting schools to make the teaching of English more inclusive of writers of colour. The Lit in Colour Pioneers pilot is supporting 100 schools which have changed their GCSE or A-level to Pearson Edexcel specification, which enables students to study set texts by writers of colour. One of these texts is The Empress, and it's a huge privilege to have Tanika with us today to discuss the play, to talk about its themes, its historical context, and what she wanted people watching the play and reading the play to take away from it. Students and teachers have been encouraged to join in this discussion and to send in questions in advance. And we've had a fantastic response. We've had some wonderful questions. And in order to respond to as many of these questions as possible, we've basically incorporated the questions into the way we framed our conversation. But we also welcome more questions in the chat. And what we're planning to do is to allow about 10 minutes or so at the end of the discussion to pick up some of these extra questions. So thank you so much to all of you for joining us and for participating already in thinking about the sort of themes you're interested in pursuing. And now we'll get started talking to Tanika. So there's Tanika coming into frame. Great. So Tanika, there was a whole cluster of questions. Hi. There were a whole cluster of questions from the floor, which revolved around, I suppose, questions of what inspired you to become a playwright, what your own background was, where you studied, and also who your inspirations were in your beginning to be a playwright. So I don't know whether you could talk a little bit about how this all came about.
Yes, well, I mean, being a playwright came quite naturally because my parents were both quite artistic. My mother was an Indian dancer and my father was a singer. And so there was always lots of drama and poetry and basically what I like to call arty-farty stuff going on in our house. So I was brought up very much with the admiration of the arts. My parents were into the Indian poet and dramatist Tagore. His name is Rabindranath Tagore, and he's actually he's the national poet of India, and I think that he wrote both the national anthem for India and Bangladesh. So they were very much steeped in his philosophy, his poetry, his drama. And so I was brought up in this kind of background. So it wasn't very unusual for me to turn around and say, well, to be interested in writing. And I remember right from an early age, my father always used to say to me, when you grow up, you're going to be a writer. So I was quite lucky in that respect. And I always liked stories and telling stories and being told stories. So in that sense, and creative writing at school as well. I think I bored my teachers and my fellow students mad with my always reading out my stories to them. Very precocious child, but yes, that's basically where it all came from.
But in a sense, history is about telling stories as well, isn't it? And studying,
Well,
thinking
yeah,
about.
as you know, Jane, I went to university to read history, and in fact, Jane was my one of my tutors there. So it's very lovely to all these years later to be back talking to my old teacher again. So, but I think in a sense that's what I loved about history. I just loved telling stories from the past, and it took me a while to actually start becoming like a professional writer. I mean, I did do jobs. I had a career in community work after I left university. I was thinking of going into social work, and then I had a chance to go to a workshop that the BBC were running on radio drama, and as a result, I had my first commission, and then I basically became a writer as a result.
But do you think it was important to have had that period of doing other things in between? I mean, was it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I didn't have my first play produced until I was about 27. So I continued to work right up until my early to mid 30s. So I was writing on the side, if you see what I mean.
Mm,
And I think that in a sense you need a bit of life experience. I mean, what are you going to write about if you've never lived, and if you've only just written stories?
mm.
So I think that for me it was quite important to work. And in fact, some of my early work was about, I worked in a young Asian women's refuge in Manchester. And I think my first TV film that I did was about that experience.
In a way, there's an analogy there with being a historian as well. I think you get better at it as you get older because you have more experience in
Yes.
a way.
Yes, exactly.
So what about your inspirations? I mean, what in terms of thinking about being a writer, did you have particular inspirations, people who inspired you?
Well,
Or
yeah, I mean, I'm very, because I did study English, English literature, and I was very, I loved novels, etc. But the thing that I remember very clearly is only ever reading white classics, as I like to call them. The Brontes and Dickens and wonderful stuff, but nothing from my own culture, and nothing. And certainly in history, it was the same. It was
mm,
Tudor, Stuarts, First World War,
mm,
Second World War, but always from the European context. So it's only when I left school and I went to university that I started reading books that were not from my culture. And I think that one of the earliest books that I read, which really, really influenced me, which is actually not a play, it's a novel, was Beloved by Toni Morrison.
mm.
And I loved that book so much. I think I gave it to almost everybody that I ever met, even in the street. I just said, "You've got to read this." And I think that as a Black writer as well, particularly, she just really inspired me. And then I
Mm.
read a lot of the other stuff, Maya Angelou, Alice Walker. And then I thought, oh, maybe I should go and try and read some, writers from my own continent. So, of course,
Mm.
off you go. So I think that, but for me, in terms of the one thing that inspired me right at the beginning, it was Beloved, which is kind of strange, isn't it? Because it's not really, it's not really my story or my ancestry, but it just somehow or other, it just made me
But
think,
it's
well, there's a
compellingly
woman out
different,
there
isn't it?
writing.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. And I suppose I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? Because you were reading novels and, and then you turned to being a playwright. I mean, is that quite an easy
Well,
transition? I mean,
yeah, well, I mean, I always thought I was going to be a novelist. I think I've told you this before, where I went after I left university. I joined this thing called the Asian Women Writers Collective, which was basically a bunch of South Asian women who met regularly to read out their own writing to each other and support each other. So I showed them my beginnings of my novel, which I thought was genius, and they told me it's not very good actually, but your dialogue is very good. Have you thought of writing plays? So I thought, oh yeah, maybe I should do that. And I went along to the workshop to try and write a play. And that's when I thought, why did I not think of this before? I was brought up with my parents acting in
Yeah.
plays all the time, and yet it didn't occur to me to actually try and write a play, which comes much more naturally to me, dialogue and entertainment and all that kind of stuff. So yes, I sort of went round it backwards.
Or possibly because your parents were so involved. I mean, one goes through a phase,
Yeah,
doesn't one sometimes?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Well, can we move towards thinking about the Empress? And a lot of people ask questions about obviously how you chose to focus on that particular period of British history, and what it was that about the multiple dialogue, multiple narratives, I suppose, which seemed to speak to what you wanted to convey, and this mixture of fictional and non-fictional characters.
It came from actually obviously I'd been writing for a while when I was commissioned by the Royal Shakespeare Company to write this, so I'd already written quite a few plays, but I'd always been obsessed with this book that called Ayers, Luskers and Princes. I think that's the name. Ayers, Luskers and Princes by Rosina Vishram, and she had written this book when she was a school teacher at the Ilia. I think it was in the 80s that she wrote it, and it was about the history of British South Asians in Britain from I think she started in the 1600s, and I was fascinated by this piece of history because I didn't know anything about the fact that there were ayers and laskers and domestic servants, etc., from such an early period. And it was quite funny. We were talking about this recently, and I was trying to remember where I got the book from, and then I realised it was you. You gave me the book back when I was at university, and I'd completely forgotten. But I'd been sort of silently obsessed with the book, and it had pictures in it and everything. And the thing that I loved about it was a very easy book to read because I'm not an academic. And so I find sometimes reading research articles quite hard work. But this book was written at my level, basically, so I could understand it. And also there were fantastic photographs in there from the 19th century of like some guy who apparently came to London I think it was Brighton, and he taught everyone how to shampoo people. He was like an Indian kind of peddler on the street who basically used to shampoo all these Victorian people's hair in the like 1840s or something, and introduced shampoo. And I thought, gosh, I didn't know that. That's like and beautiful photographs of ayers in London and of the sailors as well, and then all the princes. So really the book, the play is almost like a homage to Rosina's book because it's all there. I mean, it's all there in her book. I couldn't put everything in, obviously. I loved the idea that actually, whereas we always talk about Black people and Asian people who came over either on the Windrush or they came over, in the 60s or 70s. But actually, the fact of the matter is that our cultures have been here for many, many more years, like centuries, and it's kind of ignored.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the intersections of different people's imaginaries of that culture, I mean, are in a way at the heart of your play, aren't they? And I suppose that's partly why you wanted to have these multiple narratives sort of juxtaposed. I mean, to create a sort of mosaic of different interconnection.
Yes,
I mean, how did
what's interesting? Well, yes, I mean, I basically put everything in there. I was very interested in the politicians. So if you look at the Indian independence movement, it wasn't quite kicking off at that point yet in 1887. But you've got people like Gandhi here, you've got people like Jinnah coming over, who and later on Nehru, and all three of those people are kind of training to be lawyers in London, and then they go back to India and they become these incredible independence movement leaders, and in fact, two of them become the first premiers of Pakistan and India, Nehru and Jinnah. So I was fascinated in them, but I was also really interested in the more working class stories of the servants who were the Ayers and the Luskers. And so it's just that thing where you could either just pick up one person and go, I'm going to tell the story of Gandhi, or I'm going to tell the story of Dadabhai Naoroji in London. But then I just thought what's more interesting is the fact that there are so many different kinds of people from different classes in London from the Indian subcontinent. And that was the story I wanted to tell, to make it. And in fact, when I talked to the RSC artistic director, I said I wanted to do a costume drama with just Asians and black people with lots of corsets on. And he said to me, "Oh, I like the idea of that. Let's do that."
Yeah, and it's interesting because some of them connect with each other and some of them don't, as it were. So they're moving at the same time, but they're for the audience watching the play, in a way they're operating sort of in different images, as it were, which the audience then puts together in their imagination.
Yeah, because Rani never meets Queen Victoria.
No, exactly.
And neither does Dadabhai Naoroji either. He doesn't meet her.
Exactly.
I mean, so they don't all meet each other in the play.
But the audience, in a way, puts the bits together. And
yes, I mean, exactly.
That's an interesting question which somebody put to us, and I'll read the question in the words of the author. The question was, did you feel a sense of justice writing the play and exposing the true nature of the empire? And I wonder whether we could focus on that for a minute, because it seems to me that actually what your play is doing is actually exposing the true nature of the empire in terms of expanding its complexity, rather than having a single truth, if you like. I wonder whether you could say something about that.
I think that it's very important to tell these stories because they get sort of hidden. So I was first and foremost, I wanted to make an entertaining play that people would enjoy, rather than like being really, really angry. I mean, obviously there's a lot of stuff to be angry about the empire, and one could write a very different kind of play if one was to go down that route. But what I was particularly interested in was, going back to what I said before, that we've been here for a long time, but also that there was a mixing of the cultures. It's not that we all everyone just stayed in their own little bubble and didn't mix with each other. I mean, the fact that Dadabhai Naoroji was actually elected to the Houses of Parliament in 1891 is just extraordinary, really.
And he
that means that a lot
founded Congress, as it were.
Exactly, simultaneously founded Congress. But it does mean that a lot of English people voted him in. And now, that's, given that we've now got an Asian Prime Minister, it's quite fascinating that, that it's that happened, and that must mean that he was integrated in a way into the society, that he was trusted, as well as being racially abused by Lord Salisbury. But he was still very much part of the fabric of British society, and probably made quite a big contribution to a lot of things. So I think that that's what I was really interested. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I was interested in. And in terms of the empire, I mean, it's like there's the scramble for Africa. There's all sorts of things going on in the background. And what I wanted to focus on was Queen Victoria, not necessarily that she was an evil monarch, which she, her reign was evil, but not necessarily her. And the naivety of the woman that thinks that actually just by having an Indian servant who she adores is going to make everything better, but she doesn't really know what's going on out there. She doesn't have any idea of the sort of carnage that's going on at that very moment. Like the Boer War, she sends tins of chocolate to all the soldiers. In the meantime, they're putting them into concentration camps. But the thing is, if I was to write all of that in there, then I think everyone would just I think the audience, we'd lose the audience, wouldn't we? Be a bit depressing.
But also, I mean, I think the way you characterize the relationship, I mean, there is a sort of naivety, but there's also a constraint in her own what she can do, because I mean she's in some ways critical of how racist some of her household are. I mean, so there are gradations, aren't
Yes.
there? And she had a sort of
Yes.
incipient idea of the ways in which that could happen. So I mean that's what's human about it all, isn't it? We're dealing with real people, as it were, real characters. So it's not just they're not cardboard symbols of something. They're actually real characters interacting, aren't they? And I think that's what makes the play work, and the conversations between the different dimensions of the play. And do you think that, I mean, that sense of encounter, and I mean, I think it's interesting, isn't it, that for somebody like Gandhi, in a way, coming to London is a way of almost inventing himself as an Indian, isn't it? I mean, that there are ways in which, I mean, he reads the Bhagavad Gita for the first time in London. There are strange shifts of perspective of that sort, aren't there? Which mean that London takes on a different identity as the sort of heartland of the empire in one sense, but also something that's then going to give an opportunity for people to go back to India or wherever and be Indian nationalists. Or
Yes, well, absolutely, because I mean, Gandhi's only there in, I think, the first scene that we see him in when he's a teenager coming over to study law, and then I think he kind of disappears from the script. But I was rather tickled with the idea that that I should shove him in, even though the time is not quite right. He came in 1889, not 87. But and that's that wonderful story about him not eating, making a vow to his mother that even though he's going to London, he's not going to eat meat, drink alcohol, or go with women. And he makes this vow to her, and he vows to be a vegetarian. He spends all his time in London trying to find vegetarian restaurants, and I mean, there's a whole other story there, but I obviously couldn't go into that. But I totally agree with the fact that he came to London and then became Indian, because until he was in London, he had never read the holy book of the Hindus, which is the Bhagavad Gita, and he read it in translation with two Jewish brothers who invited him to listen to a translation. And I just think that's just amazing. That's a scene in itself.
absolutely.
Him suddenly hearing it for the first time and going, "Gosh, I really relate to this." Even though he came from India and was Indian, he'd never read it. He'd never even read it in the original Sanskrit. So the fact that he read, and then of course his entire career is as a politician is based on his religious principles, which he read in London. So it is fascinating, that thing of these characters, and I hope that it means that people will go on and read more rather than go, oh, she didn't write very much about him, let's find out. Because I think that all these, I mean, the fact that Jinnah came over to London and the first job that he had, or the first thing that he did, was to go to the Houses of Parliament to see Dadabhai Naoroji's maiden speech, or to hear it rather, and to see it, and then became his, I think he became his secretary or something for a bit. And Jinnah was fabulously wealthy. I think he had, gold Jaguar or something later on in life. But it's very interesting. All these characters are running around London, and that we never hear of them. I mean, generally we haven't heard of them until now.
So, I mean, again, people have been interested in what themes from the play are relevant for, audiences watching the play or people studying the play today. And I wonder whether you could reflect a little bit on that, and on, I guess, what's changed from your perspective from 2013, when it was first put on at Stratford, to now. And I might interject at this point that actually the RSC is in fact preparing a new production of the Empress, and anybody in year 10 who's studying it for GCSE will actually get the chance to see a newly staged production by the RSC ahead of their exams in 2024. So watch this space, as it were. But Tanika, do you want to comment on what you see as the
On themes, yes. I think that for me, what was interesting when I did the Empress at the RSC, when we were talking about the posters, etc., for the to advertise it, what they wanted to do was to stick a picture of Queen Victoria on the front. And this to me just made me think, okay, so Queen Victoria is an important character in the play, but she's not as big a character as Rani and all the others. So for me, Rani is the main protagonist, and she is the real empress. And in my language, which is Bengali, Rani also means queen, so empress. So I feel like that the beginning, the sort of getting into the play for me was really about telling that woman's story and telling the story of those ayahs, and that everything else sort of shoots off around it from it, if you see what I mean. And although Abdul Karim is important, etc., she is for me it's a feminist play, basically. That's my big theme that I would say. And the problem with asking playwrights about what their themes are is that we have no idea. And it's quite hard to kind of like pick our own plays apart, because quite often people go, oh, your play is about immigration. And you think, is it? I have no idea. I suppose it is. So it's a difficult question to answer. But I would say that the fact that, because I think one of the questions that I read earlier was, given that things were so hard, it's quite a happy ending, and Ronnie sort of seems to be all right at the end and is educated, and a lot of people ask me, and is this real? I mean, could this possibly have happened? And my thing is that after many years of writing plays, what I've noticed is that women and minorities generally always write plays where they either commit suicide at the end or something terrible happens to them. And my argument is, can't we just be uplifting sometimes? Can't we tell a nice story? And if we have followed a protagonist through thick and thin through a terrible journey, why do we have to kill them off at the end? Somebody said to me, why did she have such a happy ending? Why did she educate herself? And you go, well, sometimes it does happen. Good things do happen. And I also was thinking about my own parents when they came to this country. I know that they didn't come in 1887, but they did come in 1961. And they kind of they came as very young people, like 23, 24-year-olds. They were married. And they educate them. Well, they were educated before they came, but they continued their education, and they had a really good life here. So I think that the fact that Hurry and Ronnie at the end are there together at the docks, you kind of feel like they are for me, there are early immigrants. They are the ones that stay, and they don't go home. I mean, I'm sure they'll have a few ups and downs. It won't all be happy, but they are, for me, they were our early settlers. And as to the other themes, I don't know. Jane, you tell me.
No, I think that's, I mean, and in a way, I think the point about education, I mean, is a link, isn't it, with the present and with people reading it now. And I think, I mean, I sort of read the play and saw the play and thought a lot about the relationship between, as it were, Rani and Harry. Rani's trying to get Harry to take education seriously and helping him. And then there's a sort of mirroring of Abdul and Queen Victoria. And there are some quite interesting conversations going on there, I think, in terms of, pointing, as you say, to Queen Victoria's own lack of education in Indian language and culture, that the country she's the empress of, so whereas Rani, in a sense, is presented as much more centered in the values that she's articulating about, when people come to her village, they're treated like gods, and that whole sense of of how the British Empire is actually treating people, and how that's again stimulating. I mean, it goes on being stimulating as something to think about for audiences today, doesn't it?
But
and actually,
even some of
Sorry.
Sorry, go on, Jane.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, there are fleeting bits of evidence as well of Ayers actually, being quite independent and, operating and forming networks themselves in London in the late 19th century. So it's not unrealistic either.
No, yeah. I mean, the Ayers home did actually exist, and they did go through there,
exactly.
and I think something like 200 a year went through there, right up until 1947.
Absolutely, yeah. Sorry, you were going to say?
Yes, I was thinking about themes, and I think racism is one of them, obviously, but I again didn't want to bang on about it too much. But it's in the. I mean, I think in a sense you see it in a production more easily than you can read it sometimes. Like, for example, when Queen Victoria first meets Abdul Karim, and the prejudice that you get from Lady Sarah towards him. He probably doesn't even speak English. And then Queen Victoria says, very slowly and very loudly, "Do you speak English?" And he says, "Yes, English is one of the many languages I'm fluent in." And it just makes me think of the amount of times I've been asked that. "Do you speak English?"
Yeah.
Or I've heard my parents being asked that, or I
Yeah.
see it. It still happens to this day. The thing about the English, where they just suddenly just we've all seen it and done it, where we go
Yeah.
abroad and we start shouting really loudly and talking really slowly,
And
but in
slowly,
English,
exactly. Yeah, and in a way, it's analogous to the question of where do you come from? It's sort of which is a
Yeah,
complicated
where do you
question
come
to
from?
answer, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Can we think a little bit about the role of the audience? And I suppose there are various different types of question. I mean, one question that came from our wonderful contributors was the big question, really, of what you would like the audience to take away from seeing the play, and what sort of audiences you're envisaging, I suppose.
I think the great thing about being a playwright is you get to see the audience. It's not like writing for TV or film, where you just watch the box and you're not sure what anyone thinks. You literally sit in the audience, and I spend a lot of time watching the audience rather than watching my own play. It's very gratifying when people laugh at the same jokes every night, or cry at the same moment, or gasp at the same moment. So that's good. I think in terms of what do I want them to take away, I want them to have a good night and have an entertaining night. That's one of the things I always remember when I'm writing, is that um, like the obvious thing to say maybe, but it's not just about words. It's about what the actions are on stage, and what you as a playwright, you write what they're doing, for example, and just setting the scene on the first scene on the boat. But in terms of what I want the audience to take away from it, I really hope that they get to hear a story that they hadn't heard before. And I think that's the thing that we as playwrights are always trying to do, is to surprise the audience. The worst thing is when you go and see a play or a film, and you kind of, within the first 5 minutes, what's going to happen at the end, and or who the characters are going to be, or so I think that from my part, I'm always trying to plant a surprise, or a little twist, or take it to a place where you don't think it's going to go. I mean, I don't think you'd think that, after Hurry's dumped her and left her, you don't think that they're going to end up at the end. And that was the thing that surprised me about watching my own play, was how much people like a good love story. Extraordinary. When they finally get together at the end, when Hurry comes back, and they finally go into that clinch, everybody in the audience started to clap. I found that extraordinary. And that made me think, oh yeah, people do like a good love story. Even
Well,
if he does come back after 13 years.
And you've said in various contexts, I mean, that you don't want to be, in a sense, writing plays just for one demographic, as it were. I mean, that it's not in that sense, it's not an Asian play. You were very pleased when elderly white people came up to you and said that that this was something that they'd never known about. I mean, and could you say a little bit more about that? I mean, about putting on a play in Stratford, which is Stratford-on-Avon, which is a very particular sort of demographic to put on a play like
Yes,
this.
yes. I was surprised actually when it was on last time at Stratford, that how white the audience was and how particular they were. I mean, and I have to say that, as you know, I have my own prejudices, and I was thinking they're not going to get this play at all. I was this, but actually, you can prejudge your audience, and actually, that's not the case at all. So, like I said, many people came up to me afterwards and said how much they enjoyed it and how they didn't know about it, but also that a lot of people had actually lived in India, or their daughter-in-law was Indian, or their grandchildren mixed race, and so it is that thing again of interconnectiveness. I think that it's not for me. I don't come from a completely Asian family. My children are also mixed race, so I feel that I want to reflect that as well in my work. And I don't like the label of being an Asian writer, so that I only write for Asian people. That's not true at all. I'm interested in the whole story, and that there's friendships between, the fact that there's a friendship between Queen Victoria and her Indian manservant. I mean, I think that's an extraordinary story, and that she actually kind of falls in love with him in a platonic way, if you see what I mean. So it's kind of heartening that we can actually get on, and and that people do intermarry. But there's also abuse and all the rest of it. I mean, the Lord Oakham character isn't very pleasant. So it's not all.
But again, he sort of somehow comes out of all the complications of an abused,
Of
probably
India,
an abused
yeah.
childhood himself.
Yeah. I mean, those kind of men who came back from India were nicknamed. They were called nababs. So they're a bit like the sugar barons that came back from the plantations, where they had overseen horrific abuse of local people. Well, obviously in the West Indies it was slavery, and in India it wasn't very dissimilar to slavery.
No.
And so they come back to London or Britain, and they've got all this money and this loot that they've got from those countries, begotten by terrible means. But then they're not accepted here either by the establishment, the British establishment. They're seen as these sort of upstarts almost, or these nouveau riche, so those particular Englishmen, like Lord Oakham, were called nababs, and looked down on. And don't want to feel too sorry for him, but it's like a very complicated legacy of colonialism, basically.
But the whole culture, obviously, when in the later 19th century, when the cultures, in a sense, created jobs for ayahs. There were ships going to and fro, carrying children, back to England from India, and often they didn't see their parents for years, and it's pretty heartbreaking, sense of unnatural dislocations, if you like, of all sorts. So I mean, I think it's good to have that character in there, because it points to all the complexities of a pretty awful awful situation. There's a question that again came up in various different forms about how the play can be imagined and come to life in the classroom, and I suppose that sort of relates to a question about the importance of music and dance and film and all sorts of other aspects of the production which are there in the theatre. How do you imagine it, and how would you advise people to think about it coming to life in the classroom?
I think if you look at the script itself and not worry about music and dance and all the rest of it, you'll see that the words are there, and actually you can do whatever you want with those words in terms of how you stage them. So, and a lot of the scenes are actually not with many characters. So all the Queen Victoria scenes are with either 2 or 3 people. Lady Sarah, Queen Victoria and Abdul Karim, and they're sort of like, I think that they're quite interesting scenes to do because they represent three different perspectives. They're always in, presenting a different idea. And Lady Sarah, to a certain extent, represents the entire court, but she's just one person. So I think that those are quite interesting three-handers to do. And then, of course, Rani and Harry, whenever they're together, those scenes are actually just the two of them. So I think that actually you can play with them. And in terms of what music and what song and what dance you do, you can or you cannot. I mean, it's interestingly, after the RSC production, I saw another production which was absolutely stripped down without any music or song in it, which is in the script, and it worked really well. It didn't need all the music and singing. Obviously, when you're doing it at the RSC, you've got a big stage and you need to kind of fill it. so that's what that was all about. But actually, it's quite a simple play in many ways, and I think one can have fun with it.
Well, also people can, I suppose, develop their own without all the panoply of the Royal Shakespeare Company. I mean, you can produce your own music, your own dance, and
yeah, totally.
I mean, you mentioned earlier that you'd wanted to put on a costume drama, and I was interested by that because the director actually said, that she was wanted to be very careful not to make the play seem like a costume drama, partly because there's so much slightly, heritagey costume drama, particularly about the Victorian period, out there, and she wanted to sort of give it a bit more edge, if you like. I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, how does one get that balance right of deploying music? And there was a lot of crossover music, wasn't there, of which again pointed to complexity and to pluralism of cultures. I mean, is that the way to do it, to cut across, doing straightforward, one-dimensional costume drama, as it were, or risking looking?
No, well, I mean, yeah. You see, the problem is that as playwrights, we just we're quite one-dimensional in that we're just thinking about the words and we imagine a world, but we can't really do it because we're not designers or directors. And the directors and the designers and the sound designers and the lighting designers and the costume people come on, and they have a completely different idea of what they think your play's about. And quite often, and more often than not, they're absolutely right, and they breathe life into it in a way that you cannot imagine. Well, not in your sitting at my desk here, I couldn't imagine that. And so I think that actually, one of the wonderful things about theatre is it's very collaborative, which means that you all work together to make something work, and that they're not allowed to change your words, but they can imagine your world for you and always with you alongside. But what's lovely about play, and you see it with Shakespeare plays, every single Shakespeare production is slightly different. They either put it in modern dress or not modern. They set it in period of history or in in a I don't know, somewhere else. So I think that in that sense I'm quite open for other people to interpret whatever they want, as long as they don't change my words. The words remain the same. But yes, I think I'm open to whatever interpretations. It's really exciting. It's exciting when you have more than one production as well, because it's a different play every time. It's the same play, but it's different.
Was there a moment in the original production which actually, because of the way it was conceived by the director and by everybody else involved, I mean, was there anything that was completely struck you afresh? I mean, struck you as being,
yeah. I mean, it is that thing of seeing all these different diverse communities on stage, and I think that the Lascars, the sailors, were not only Indian; they were from all different parts of the world. The same with the Ayers; they were from China, they were from Samoa, and they were from the Solomon Islands. And it was interesting that the director chose to mix it up as well a bit with the casting, so that they weren't all Indian, they weren't all white, they were Africans, and they were and I liked that. I thought, well, I hadn't actually written that into the script, but I think that feels more like reality. That's what it was really like.
Great. So can we move to sort of slightly sideways, to think about, there's a question that's come in, which relates to the whole Lit in Colour project, which is a question about whether you think there should be the question was whether there should be any one text compulsory which all pupils should, without fail, study, in pursuit of this
As in
project.
play, as in a play, or as
The
in
question was
novel?
open. I mean, any one text, but it could be a play, it could be a novel. I mean, in other words, is there a sort of
Yeah.
canonical play written by a person of colour that you think everybody should read or is there? I mean, I'm glossing it now. Or is there a sense in which you want to open up different authors, of colour, and in a sense get away from the idea of a canon? I mean, you've adapted plays which are canonical in the Western, tradition. So, I mean, you obviously think about ideas of, plays that are regarded as central to a particular tradition. And how does one dislodge that, I suppose, is what's behind this question. Does one
Yeah,
do
I
it
mean, I don't think there's one. I don't think. Yeah, I wouldn't say there was one. I mean, obviously, I would say everyone should study Beloved. I think it is on the GCSE curriculum, actually.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say there's one. I think it just needs to be opened up a lot more. I mean, there are so many brilliant plays out there written by people of colour, but also novels. I mean, look at all the amazing novels that are out there. There's one that's just won the Booker Prize this year, by a Sri Lankan writer whose name I've completely forgotten. But I mean, those are the sort of things that should be on the curriculum. And the problem is that for too long it's either been, what is the one? Inspector Calls that everyone seems to
Yes.
always do, or a great play, but can we do something else as well? And the problem is if you're a person of color studying, if you don't see yourself at all in any of the texts that are being studied, then it's very hard to see yourself going into that world at all.
Mm.
And if I had relied on just the English lit that I did at school, I would never have become a writer, because
Yeah.
I didn't see myself. I didn't see any role models. I didn't see. I
Mm.
mean, I think it's very, very different now, clearly.
Yeah.
But I'm talking 30 years ago, more than
Yeah.
30 years ago.
It's interesting. A question's just come in on the chat saying, were you surprised that the Empress was being taught in schools, and what impact do you hope your fabulous play will have on young audiences? And I guess you've just answered it by saying,
Yeah, I mean, what's lovely about it was that it did get a very good response from the audience when it was on, but what was not so lovely about it was that it just disappeared for 10 years.
Mm.
So it it was only on for about 4 weeks or something. It had an amazing audience reaction and good reviews, and then that's it. And
Mm.
so what's wonderful about it being on the GCSE curriculum is that it's going to come back and more people will see it
Mm.
and talk about it. I mean, it's the history that I uncovered was already there. It's not like uncovering it. It's just about bringing it to the light. And I think that there are lots of other plays that are going on now that are re-examining, what our historical understanding of a situation or a period is. And I think that's really interesting. It's like history, isn't it, Jane? It's about this
Mm.
where you look at it and who tells the story and who's holding the pen, I guess.
Yeah,
How do
absolutely.
we tell those stories? And the gatekeepers at the theatres, I like to call them gatekeepers. They're the people that shut the gates to you if you try and get a play on that's not according to their taste. They're changing as well. And so I think that there are more plays going on out there, and particularly after Black Lives Matter, which
Yeah,
which
absolutely.
reflect the diversity of this country, of this
Mm.
community,
Yeah, and
as it should be.
the whole point about drama is that one learns more about oneself by engaging with stories about other people, isn't it?
Yeah.
That you develop your own sensitivity to difference, I suppose, don't you? And
Yes. I mean, you think about one of the most successful films in the last 5 years has been a Korean film called Parasite,
yeah.
which was just an amazing film about, poverty and trying to live in rich people's houses and how the rich live and how the poor live. And it's entirely in Korean, but it's entirely universal. And that's what we hope all our plays are, that whether or not they're set in the Chinese community, the Indian community, the Kenyan community, they are universal stories, because everyone lives, everyone dies, everyone suffers, and everyone has joy. So it's just about how you engage.
Absolutely. So have you got any advice to offer to young playwrights? I mean, people out there who are studying your play and who are thinking that they'd like to start, writing themselves?
I think first and foremost, I would say read a lot of plays, as well as go and see plays if you can. I understand that going to watch plays is quite expensive. So have a look at theatres who do special reductions for young people. And also write every day. I think the problem is that people spend a lot of time saying, I want to write, I'm going to write, I've got a novel in me, I've got a play in me. And they get to the age of 60 and they still haven't done it because they've been talking about it. So I would say that the main thing to do is, even if it's only 10 minutes every day, write anything you want. And I think that, whether it's a poem, whether it's a scene or of dialogue. And lastly, I would say try and join a workshop where you meet other people who want to write as well. Because I think that that's really invaluable. You get to talk, because otherwise it's a very lonely occupation, sitting on your own at a desk writing and thinking, and then tearing all your bits of paper up because you think it's rubbish, because we're our own worst enemies. So I would say join a workshop, often local libraries, if there are any local libraries left, but you'll be surprised how many there are. And if you go to a new writing theatre like the Royal Court or Birmingham Rep, for example, they will have their own sort of connections with new writers that you can join a workshop. And it's just I wouldn't say it's like Alcoholics Anonymous, but it is very nice meeting other writers, because you suddenly realize, you're all obsessed with the same things: stationery, chairs and computers, as well as writing plays, going to see plays together, discussing them, because it is a collaborative thing.
Yes, and I guess reading all sorts of different things as well. I mean, not just plays, but novels and short stories, and just thinking about words, I suppose, and music.
Yeah, and I think it's also about having an opinion on something. I don't think it's and I do a lot of teaching, and some writers say to me, I don't really like politics, I'm not into it. And I think, well, what do you mean? I don't really want to say anything about this subject. You think, well, actually, if you don't have an opinion, what are you writing about? And in many ways, I often think that plays are a bit like an essay. You've got an argument you've got to make, and that people want to hear what your voice is. They don't want to hear you just sort of like philandering around, doing a balanced play. They actually want to hear what you have to say. Whether or not they agree with it is another matter. So I think it's great to have to kind of think quite deeply about, what is it you feel about the world? What is it that you want to say about the world, and then say it in a play.
Well, that seems a brilliant moment on which to end. And the other good thing is to remember where we started. I mean, that actually you get better at it as you have more life experience. So actually, it's worth starting and just experimenting, and not feeling that you're going to get to some perfect moment immediately. That it's all a series of experiments, in truth, I suppose, isn't it?
Yes, and most playwrights' middle name is rewrite. You rewrite and rewrite and rewrite until you get it right.
And enjoy it, I guess. That's the other thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't imagine doing anything else now.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Tanika. It's been wonderful having you, and thank you so much to the audience. I'm sorry we can't actually see you, but we've had all your wonderful questions to frame our conversation, so we're really grateful for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane.